All right, folks, this is Scott with the Game Audio Institute, and we are back with another music systems analysis video and looking at the music systems inside games, popular games. And our last one that we checked out was Skyrim. That was going to be based sort of on a fantasy kind of long ago world, essentially. But now we're going to be zooming ahead into the present day and looking at basically a Japanese RPG game called Persona 5, the latest in the Persona series, which was originally released in 2017. Now, there's a fairly new or newer improved version, basically, that just recently got released on the PC and on the Xbox Pass as well, which is really cool. And so you guys can, play it if you're really interested. But basically, again, this is going to the skill that you need to have in order to be thinking about being in this industry, which is to analyze how people do it in the real world. Basically, how do they do it in an actual popular game? So, without any further ado, let's get into analysis. Persona 5 is the latest version of the long-running Persona series of video games that started well over 20 years ago, released by Atlus. But this particular version of the game franchise is a much more flashy, bold, cartoon style, and the music soundtrack for it, which is created by Shoji Meguro, and which has 113 tracks, mind you, lots of tracks. The soundtrack is generally more contemporary and modern. Instead of using a big, large orchestra like we've already heard in these previous things, in Skyrim, for example, this one's got a much smaller band playing with basically, rhythm section percussion with guitar, bass, piano, electric organ, and electric piano. So the music styles of the game are more funky and hip, and many tracks feature a vocalist as well, and they range widely from pop to funk to rock and to blues. Shoji Meguro is a guitarist, so he gets a lot of work in this particular game. And it's a large reason why people keep wanting to come and play the game and stay in the game for hundreds and hundreds of hours. I'm not kidding. Anyway, so the basic plot of the game is that you're a high school student recently forced to move to a new area. You're working off of probation from a recent incident in which you were unjustly framed, and you meet student friends at the school, where you discover dirty and corrupt dealings among the faculty. But you also find out that you and your new buddies can go into an alternate reality, called the Metaverse, strangely enough, where you can change the hearts of these corrupt people by defeating enemies, which are called shadows, with a newfound spiritual power called a persona, hence the name of the series. So, all through the game, there's basically two realities. There's going to be the real world and that of the metaverse, and you're constantly going in and out of locations in both of these realities. The music system is either changed by location or some significant game event, and all those music tracks are looped so that they never really end and they instead fade out. There's also no playlist. So in other words, if you're doing some type of music, it doesn't just automatically flip to another piece of music unless you do something different in the game. But you tend to do things very different, very quickly. You tend to change what you're doing, going into buildings, changing locations, or things like that. So this is going to happen fairly often, and you won't really detect the fact that, hey, there's only one piece of music playing, because you're constantly going in and out of locations, and they'll be oftentimes changing the music. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the open world channel, right? So the open world channel is essentially sort of the 2016 era urban Tokyo, effectively. So you get Shibuya Station and everything like that. In fact, then there's this imaginary town called Yongen-jaya. And essentially, it's going to get a few themes which can be triggered by events or entering places. So there's going to be lots of different kinds of themes and that sort of stuff. And as we mentioned before, there's not really a playlist per se. It's mainly single types of themes that are triggered by various kinds of actions in the game and locations in the game. The first thing you're going to hear very frequently is the evening, what I call the evening and morning theme, essentially. I think it's called Beneath the Mask. And the idea is that the theme is heard the most frequently when daily life is occurring and may or may not actually be affected by location in the real world. So sometimes you can go to other locations and this music will still be playing, which is a bit of a rarity. Usually in most cases, the music is only for that particular location. And this is one of those ones that's a little bit more open-ended. It can kind of do other kinds of things. So if you go into the subway, or you're arriving at the school, or if you're in your apartment in the evening, basically you get that same theme. Now, the interesting thing is because it appears so often inside the game, it actually often gives a little bit of extra alternate mixing. So when you actually are playing in the prologue version of the game, which takes several hours to kind of get through, essentially, then basically the theme is played by the full band without the vocals. But once you get past the prologue and into the early part of the game proper, when you actually start getting into the sort of the daily game loop, then what happens is that theme is often reduced to the keyboards only. It does return to the instrumental mix at some point, and then it actually will also add the vocalist singing the song Beneath the Mask. So the idea in the case is that it basically acts as a fallback. So after your quests are finished and you come home, you're going to hear that sound. You get up the next morning, you go to the school, you're going to hear that sound. You're going to hear that piece, basically. So it's a very common theme that you're going to hear a lot of times. Continuing on with the real-world locations, there are two locations that are pretty commonly going to be used by you in order to prepare yourself for the metaverse. So the first one is the Airsoft shop, which actually sells replica guns. In Japan, you can't actually buy legal guns, comparatively speaking, so you buy these replica guns. And luckily for you, in the metaverse, they actually work, so that's a really useful thing for your team. The second location that is also useful is the doctor's office, and this is the place where you can buy all kinds of health-related things to kind of help your team recover during battles and even after battles and stuff like that. And that has its own theme as well. There's usually another theme that often takes place when you decide to go and investigate the busy shops in Shibuya and the central street there. And some of the shops do have just sort of general in-house music that's like through a speaker, so diegetic music basically, not really soundtrack music. That would be like the Big Bang Burger and the convenience store. Now, there is an interesting thing that takes place as well that kind of tends to overrule what music is playing. And that is weather, which means that if it rains, then all of a sudden your music changes basically back to that Beneath the Mask theme. Incidentally, the rain will actually start directly after school, though it sometimes does start in the morning, but it will continue through any of the outside locations that aren't things that you can go into, like stores and stuff like that. So any of the outside sort of locations like streets, even the hideout on the roof, it'll be playing that Beneath the Mask loop. The next one to talk about is that you're a student, you're in school, you're at the school at the Shujin Academy, and basically the idea is that the next thing you're going to do is you're going to go to school and then you're going to be in class. And there's only one theme that basically plays here all the time whenever you're doing this kind of stuff, pretty much. The next one to talk about is the after-school theme. So right after you finish your morning time in class, essentially, then you're going to be going into the after-school theme, which is kind of a high-paced, sort of thing with the electric piano and stuff like that. And it's more upbeat and funky, and basically it takes place after school when the group meets on the rooftop of the school to determine the plans. I believe that oftentimes that when you get to the actual hideout, then that could often be another piece of music, but it sometimes doesn't use that music. So that can vary sometimes. So before we close out the section on the outside worlds, we need to talk about the cutscenes. There are lots and lots and lots of cutscenes in this game because it's extremely story-driven. These can be found in both the real world and the metaverse, and also in pretty much every single area that we're going to be talking about in the future sections of this video. There are basically two types of cutscenes. You have cutscenes in which you are going to click through them, and they can involve interviewing you, the protagonist, or they can involve other outside people, and there will be a variety of different kinds of clips that will play in those particular kinds of cases. The other type of cutscene is a much more fully animated, in fact, it looks like anime, basically, scene in which music is already sort of baked in effectively as part of the cutscene, essentially. So I think that pretty much covers the real world. Let's talk about the next world, which is the Metaverse. So the Metaverse channel essentially is all of the places that you're going to be in the Metaverse. Metaverse locations are going to have their own thing. You'll have various loops that play. They kind of are a little bit more groove-based. They don't have a lot of melody associated with them, but they're basically going to have their own sort of exploration themes that are kind of, relatively subdued, but still funky and nice and cool and interesting like that. And most likely that, depending on palaces, you'll probably have different ones available for that kind of stuff. But the idea is that the general exploration music, there's probably 1, maybe 2 tracks or so of the general exploration music loops that are happening. And again, one doesn't stop and then the other one plays. Again, so there's no playlist. It's just like a constant loop. Once you leave a room and go to the next room or something like that, or you finish a battle, it might go to another piece of music, but it won't be an obvious kind of stopping of a play of a piece of music and then going to another piece of music in that location. Another location worth mentioning inside the game is called Mementos, and it's basically a procedurally generated area where you can drive around inside tunnels and things like that in a similar manner as you do into the palaces. And of course, it also comes with its own loops as well. The next thing to talk about that's super important is combat. Yes, you can only enter combat mode in the metaverse. You can't just fight people in the real world or anything like that. And you can only do this if the enemy sees you or you decide to ambush them, essentially. Most of the time, it's a funky upbeat track with vocals and lyrics that gets you hyped up for a turn-based battle.
There's 2 enemies! Don't underestimate them!
This isn't it.
And basically, they almost all have the same music, except when you get to the higher boss enemies, and the big boss, of course, at the end is usually going to have their own kind of theme as well. So mostly when you're doing battle, you're going to get this funky upbeat track, which will basically get you ready to do this, to do battle with your shadow enemies. And then once they are defeated, you will go into the sort of result area. And that's essentially a cutscene, but it is one of the that's the first type of cutscene where you have to sort of click through it. Once you finish clicking through it, the game will return you back into the gameplay loop and the gameplay music that you're basically normally hearing inside the palaces. There is an alternative loop that can happen at times because the shadows can decide to bargain with you if they are damaged but not yet quite killed. And they can basically then negotiate with you for potentially power or money or an item. There's another thing to talk about that's a loop that takes place in very specific locations in palaces. And those are called safe rooms. So safe rooms are very important because basically whenever you're in the metaverse, you can't usually save the game. You can't save your progress. But if you get to a safe room, you can. So safe rooms are very, very important. They're going to get their own special loop as well. Besides the metaverse stuff, as we have talked about, we also have what's called the Velvet Room. So the Velvet Room is a very specific place in which you can go and it's kind of a development lab for your personas. That's eventually what its role is inside the game. The idea, though, is that, you'll sort of experience it in kind of dream form for a while, and it kind of tends to play as cutscenes that you have to sort of, click through, essentially. But the idea ends up being that if you actually, get through it, once you get through it and you're actually in the game loop, then the Velvet Room becomes a location where you can work on your personas. And you can fuse them and, merge them and destroy and recreate new ones, basically. That's the idea. But while you do that, there's a nice, lovely, beautiful, almost classical loop with like wordless vocals that plays over this. Quite romantic, actually. Very different than almost any other track inside the space. So it's really obvious to tell you that this is a very different, location. So our final theme that we're going to cover, essentially doing this, is something that takes place essentially in the present day of the game. Whereas most of the action that you're dealing with when going to the metaverse and things like that, that actually takes place in the more recent past. The present day is when you're being actually interviewed by the assistant DA about all the various things that you've been doing, essentially. And what it usually follows this many times is that you have, in fact, started to make a connection with a confidant. And then it'll give you an achievement sort of stinger or whatever in order to be able to indicate that you have now a heightened relationship with a particular person in the game. So, wrapping this analysis up, Persona 5 is an incredibly complicated and story driven game with many, many, many different things going on. And we've just barely scratched the surface in terms of like the overall length of the game, and many things will be different. Keep in mind that when you're doing the prologue, many times there are many different kinds of loops and music and things like that. Where we didn't cover those particular parts of the thing. But when you get into the actual sort of gameplay loop, it begins to resemble more or less what we've analyzed in this case. But of course, as the game develops, there's going to be more loops and more pieces of music and more locations you can go into and all this other kind of stuff. This is just based on my own personal analysis. This isn't based on any kind of knowledge from, the game company or anything like that. But at this point, we're going to wrap it up. And we'll see you again next time. If we don't break here. All right, folks, that basically takes us out for this particular analysis. Stay tuned for more of these. And speaking of more of these, if you have a particular game that you would like to see covered, why don't you put a little comment down below and let us know what you might be thinking. Or if you need anything else, we're basically ready and open and willing to listen to whatever, is going on with you guys in terms of like what you're interested in and what you want to see more of. So anyway, we will be back with another one of these things. Our next one will probably be on the Tetris effect. So we'll see you there. And anyway, if you like any stuff, obviously like. If you like this video, share. If you want to share it, and of course subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you want to be notified of all of our awesome videos that are dropping whenever they drop. Anyway, at this point in time, I hope this helps you get your game audio on. See you next time.